Right. The plan for this week with fall break, I'm going to be traveling out of town to call an auction for a military veterans organization in West Virginia. But we have a plan for class, and that is I'm going to upload a lecture on levers. We're going to finish off the levers. Now that I have some muscles that we can see to explain the leverage concepts, I can finish up the information on how leverage really works in the human body. In addition, for my everydayers, my people that like to get their hands dirty, come to class, Lindsay is going to do a workshop on the process of how to figure out agonists and contractions. My process works for me, but my brain is very scattered. I'm very verbal. Hey, see this, see this, see this. Lindsay kind of condensed it. Lindsay did her internship with me last semester, and she condensed it to a very organized structure, which might work better for people who are more organized and structured. In addition, Grace is going to be here if anybody has any hip questions and stuff. And then on top of that, I'm going to be available. If there's any questions, just call me. Hey, Dr. Campbell, we have this question about, I'm going to be available. Okay. So we'll really make sure we give you everything you need so that we all do real well on our test. Right, we're ready to go? Let's finish up this big class. Before I get back into the muscles, I want to point something out. The hip has a lot of muscles, but they serve two purposes, as I mentioned last class. Not only is it for mobility to get us around and move us, to have strong muscles to move all the stuff on top of it, but also for stability. We have to have strategic muscles in certain places to make sure we maintain that hip articulation. There's a dislocated hip. It's a bad, bad, bad day. I created these. So there's been version 2, version 3, and sometimes you have to compromise. I like to, when possible, put things in anatomical placement, meaning the semimembranosus is the most medial, then the tendinosus, then the biceps femoris is most lateral. All three of them cross the hip joint because they all originate in the same ischial tuberosity, but I wanted to show how they have a spatial relationship. So instead of putting them vertically on the line, I put them in a box to show membranosus is most medial, tendinosus is in the middle, biceps femoris is most lateral. And that box is on the line. It's like a tightrope walker with a long beam using for balance. That person's center of mass is still on the rope, even though some of the bar is on the right side, some of it's on the left side. The overall is in the middle. So you can see that here. I have three muscles, but all three are on the anterior posterior axis, meaning they're extension pullers, but this one is not an adductor and this one is not an abductor because the box is on the fence. Same thing here, gluteus medius and minimus. They're in a box, the box is on the fence, meaning they are neither flexors nor extensors, they are just abductors. And then I taught you that the anterior fibers can be internal rotating. You have four muscles, my favorite muscles of the hip, because finally, instead of some Latin word for flounders that we're gonna see later on, you have muscles called the adductor brevis, the adductor longus, the adductor magnus, like actual hole in their names. Hallelujah, praise the Lord. So these four muscles are arranged spatially. The magnus is a little more anterior, longus, brevis, gracilis. But all four of those muscles are on a box, and that box is on the axis. Does that make sense? That makes sense? So in other words, these are going to be adductors, but that one's not a flexor because it's not by itself in that box. It's sitting the fence. It's still on the bilateral axis.
It says that the gracilis is a knee flexor also.
Absolutely. When we get to our knee circle, you're going to see them. It's a great question. And you're going to see these three at the knee. You're going to see that one at the knee. You're going to see that one at the knee. And what's cool is that once we look at them at the knee, then we're going to be able to do some practical things like length tension relationship. How do you increase the contribution of a muscle at the knee because you're stretching it at the hip? Or how do you decrease it? You slack it at the hip so that it's pulling less at the knee. We're going to have those conversations. Like, why does a seated calf raise emphasize certain muscles over other? We're going to be able to have those conversations with multi-articular muscles. It's going to be cool. But my opinion is biased. All right. So moving on. Remember, guys, for function, all that matters is, can we see how it crosses the joint? Origins and insertions doesn't matter. How does it cross? Does it cross in the front, outside, inside, back, spin this way, spin that way? So we did the tensor fasciae lata, and we showed you the sagittal pull, we showed you the frontal pull, and then I explained the transverse pull. Now we're going to talk about our good friend, the gluteus maximus. Now, gluteus maximus is, let's see how I can put this, to move all of our mass. It makes sense that we kind of have to have an all-star muscle, our gluteus maximus, the biggest powerful muscle in the body. Technically, the tongue's not going to get you to have a 40-inch vertical leap. Okay? But part of the magic of the gluteus maximus is not only physiologically, it's a big, strong muscle, but biomechanically. And I'm going to get into this with levers, but I'm just planting a seed. The gluteus maximus, as it crosses the hip posteriorly, in other words, from the back, you could look at it and literally see those fibers wanting to pull the hip into a direction of extension. So it's going to be an extension pull. That's kind of obvious. But the insertion, where it's pulling, there's an illusion here that it blends into the IT vein. Excuse me. Does y'all know what fascia is? Myofascial release. So fascia is what we shrink wrap our muscles. You have one continuous fascia through your whole body. It's really cool. And then we compartmentalize like vacuum seal muscles in between this big fascia. So sometimes it looks like these muscles blend into something, but that's not tendon, that's fascia. And fascia is important for a lot of different reasons, but one, proprioception, communication between muscles, joint location, place and space, acceleration, feedback, biofeedback for your engines and your core. So the gluteus maximus actually passes underneath that IT band and inserts on your femur. Let's see if I have a... There we go. Look at that. That looks like a muscle that can generate some power. Like, does it make sense? Like a muscle like that wouldn't want to be pulling on a string. Like a muscle that big wants to yank on a big sturdy bone so that we can jump up, run, push, squat. Okay. Now, what I also want you to notice, remember limitations of two-dimensional pictures in a three-dimensional world. You know that this trochanter, that hip bone, you know this. Make sure I have it right. Well, you know that this hip bone jets out. So this gluteus maximus is not passing over the top, is what I'm trying to show you. It's not passing over the top to do this. It's passing underneath. So that's why it's only going to have an extension pull and lateral or external rotation. Does that make sense? If it did pass over the top, well, then it would have more abduction. So we don't need, you know what we need that big muscle for? For us to do this. You're not, I say not ever, but it's more important we have powerful, powerful extensors than powerful, powerful abductors. We need abductors, but we need to put all our eggs into this extension basket for us to be able to jump and run, squat. Okay. So the function, remember, function is just direction pull. Powerful hip extensor and lateral or external rotator. Can everybody see that? You should just be able to see how those fibers run and say, oh, I can see how it's pulling in a direction of extension, and I can see how it's trying to spin the merry-go-round in a direction of lateral rotation. And remember, even though your circles are all from the right side, you have the same muscles on the left. So if I gave you a left, and you say, oh, that's the left hip extensors, just go to your right-sided circle and say, who are the hip extensors on the right side? Because they're the same muscles as yours. That is a good view. Remember, I try to show different views. This is, I'd say it's a better, I think both views are great, but it's a really good view of the lateral rotation pull of the gluteus maximus at the hips, the mirror effect. All right. Let's save our hamstrings for last. Let's get to our adductor groups. Have you ever heard the adductors? Right? You've heard those, the adductor muscles. I pulled an adductor. Okay. So these are muscles that specifically cross medially at the hip on the inside. And they're going to be pulling in a direction of adduction. Love these muscles because most of them have adductor in their name. Love it. I'm going to get to you in a second, Gracilis, but let's look at this adductor magnus. And see how we want to pulling the femur into the pubis. Adductor magnus, adductor longus, and adductor brevis. So brevis and longus are communications of tendon length, not muscle length. So brevis has short tendons, and the longus has longer tendons. But look how cool. Adductor brevis, adductor longus, adductor magnus. Guys, if I ask you on the test, what's the function of the adductor magnus? It's a hip adductor. That's how it pulls. That doesn't mean you can't have abduction. It can, if it's working eccentrically. Yeah, if you were doing a straight leg raise, and you were using the inside of your leg, and I'm going up against gravity, and I'd use my adductors concentrically to adduct, and then I lowered it down. It'd be the adductors working eccentrically, but there would be abduction. Function is how does it pull? Because it pulls that way all the time. So these should be pretty easy. So when they say you pulled an adductor, it's a medial inside muscle that pulls in the direction of adduction. This is your first, you're going to have a few, but this is where you have like sister muscles, and then you have a cousin. Apple, banana, strawberry, sledgehammer. One of those doesn't belong. Adductor longus, adductor brevis, adductor magnus. And then you have this one that is in the family, but it has a different name, gracilis. Gracilis is a hip adductor. But to your point earlier, the reason it's not called like adductor skinniness or something like that is because it crosses into the knee joint. How many of you have ever heard of the quad muscles? I mean, like the real names of the quad muscles, like the vasti. So think about this. Your four muscles, you quad. Vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, vastus intermedius. Ooh, that sounds like a pattern. Rectus femoris. Oh, Lord, why did they do that? Well, because your vastis only cross the knee and your rectus crosses the hip. That's why they do these things. So you have similar names for the try English, for the similar functioning muscles, And then when you have a muscle that's in the same family, but it goes off to college in some other joint, we give it a different style. Does that make sense? So all of these are medial crossing muscles. Gracilis, adductor magnus, adductor longus, adductor brevis. And then you get into this really cool adductor called the pectineus. Pectineus. I've heard it called all kinds of stuff. I've heard it called creatine. I've heard it called creatinine. CMOS sign. The pectineus, this view, real easy to see the adduction point. What's tough about a two-dimensional picture is that unlike these other adductor muscles, the pectineus is coming from the pubis, which is anterior to the hip joint. A side view of the pectineus. Yes, perfect. Perfect. You wink. Look at that. So if there's no way we would have been able to see this anterior pull if we didn't look at the hip at a different angle. And from this view, there's no way to see the medial or adductor if we didn't see the upper angle. See what I'm getting at? So we need to be aware that sometimes when we're looking at muscles in books, that's only a two-dimensional picture. That may only show you one plane of pull. And to see the different planes, we have to see the different books. Look at that. We can easily see the flexion pull, but I have no idea that this is more inside than that, unless I change the view. Is that making sense? Change the view. Look at that. Now I can see the adduction pull, but without that lateral view, you can't see the flexion pull. Make sense? All right, so let's go to our circles, or our lists. Again, I don't judge, I just want right answers. And let's see what we have so far and make sure we all understand. So we have had tensor fasciae lata, hip flexor, hip abductor, hip internal rotator. We have had the gluteus, medius, and minimus, lateral crossing, hip abductor, the anterior fibers or internal rotation. Remember, these are all in the box. This does not mean this, and that does not mean that. Okay? Piriformis, abductor, external rotator. Gluteus maximus, hip extensor, external rotator. Saving the hamstrings for last. Adductor group. Apple, banana, strawberry, sledgehammer. Adductor magnus, longus, brevis, gracilis. Goes off to college at the knee. These guys don't. Our 5 sharpshooting specialized hip rotators, like the rotator cuff at the hip. Gemellus superior, gemellus inferior, obturator, externus, obturator, internus, quadratus, femoris, obturator, externus, quadratus. They sit both fences, so they are neither front, back, medial, or lateral. They're just there to play on the merry-go-round. Sense? Pectineus or pectineus, hip flexor, hip adductor, which we just did. I gave you the iliopsoas. That's the first muscle we did. So we got to do sartorius, rectus femoris, and our hamstrings. Sartorius. That's how it is. All right, guys. Let's do rectus first. Rectus femoris is part of your quad. Just mention it. That's why I'm doing this one. It's part of your quad, but it's the one quad muscle that goes off and lives in your hip, crosses the hip. So your other quad muscles that don't cross the hip, that only cross the knee, they're going to have similar names. Vastus medialis, one on the inside, vastus lateralis on the inside, vastus intermedius in the middle, then rectus femoris. There are biomechanical reasons to have multi-articular muscles working in these groups. I'm going to explain that. It's going to be fun to learn length tension relationships and why if you can have a muscle slacked on one end, you make other muscles work harder on the other end. And if you stretch it on the other end, you're going to be able to emphasize it more on the other end. Use practical examples. If I have a TheraBand, and that TheraBand is trying to function at both of my hands, if I stretch it here, doesn't it make sense? It's going to pull more there. And it's going to come into play with stretching. One of the reasons, if we wanted to stretch a muscle like the rectus, which crosses the hip and the knee, something you already know. That's why we want to flex the knee and then extend the hip, and it feels like our leg's about to rip apart because I'm literally stretching it at both ends. Like we're going to learn things like that. So the rectus femoris at the hip, we'll get to its knee function at the knee, analyze joint by joint, one muscle at a time. But it crosses the hip nice and anterior, right in front. When I lecture about levers, I'm going, hey guys, remember how the iliopsoas crossed and inserted very close to the hip? Look how far away this muscle inserts the hip. There's some mechanical advantages and disadvantages of that. That's my lecture on Wednesday. The longest muscle in the body, sartorius. Sartorius is a long strap-like muscle. Limitations of two-dimensional pictures for three-dimensional concepts. This muscle crosses the hip in the front and then spirals around and ends up crossing the knee in the back. That's going to matter when you talk about the knee function. Long strap-like muscle. If anybody's ever seen bodybuilders and their legs, it almost seems like there's like a border on the inside of their leg. That's usually the sartorius muscle that you can see it wrapping around, going anterior, posterior. This muscle is commonly referred to as the Taylor's muscle. I'd love for you to know that because remember I lectured or talked about how we don't want to put muscles in slings because muscles get tight if you keep them slack, if you keep them short. Put an arm in a sling for weeks, that muscle is going to be tight when you get that elbow out. Okay? So this muscle, the sartorius, is a hip flexor. It's not a significant external rotator because you got your gluteus max, you got these big, powerful external rotators, so its function there is very minimal, but it does have an external rotation pull, and it's a knee flexor. And they would have problems with seamstresses back in the day who would sit for hours and hours and hours tailoring because that muscle would be slacked at the hip in two different ways and slacked at the knee. And so over the course of time, that muscle would get very, very, very tight, have contractures. And so the sartorius. And then finally, to wrap it up, and then we'll do some application practice, your hamstrings. All right. You have 3 hamstrings, semimembranosus, semitendinosus, and biceps femoris. We are looking at the hamstrings as they cross the hip. When we get to the knee, we'll talk about the knee function, and then we're going to put those things together to look at why in the world do we have certain muscles that have biarticulations? What does that do for us? How does that give us mechanical advantage? So this view, I think, is the best view because it shows the posterior crossing. This is a lateral view. So here's the bilateral axis of the hip, crossing behind. So it has an extension pull. If it was in the front, it would have a flexion pull. Okay. So semimembranosus is the most medial. Semitendinosus, all of them are starting on the ischial tuberosity and working their way down to the knee. And then the biceps femoris. Here is where I'm going to get nitpicky, only because Dr. George was nitpicky. Biceps means two heads. Ceph is, George said, a Latin origin for cephalic head, cephalocolic, something with head, two head muscle of the femur. If we say biceps femoris, we are basically saying both heads do something. The two heads of the biceps femoris is a long head that crosses the hip and a short head that does not. So if I say, what does the biceps femoris do? That's saying, what do both heads do? And we're going to learn both heads pull at the knee. But both heads do not pull at the hip. Not even close. So how do we communicate that only the long head of the biceps femoris is a hip extensor? We simply say, the long head of the biceps femoris is a hip extensor. Biceps femoris, long. Practice. What is the first thing we want to do to figure out muscles? We want to not just go straight to the names. We want to establish, that's what Lindsay's going to be working with you on Wednesday. She has a much more organized process than me. Mine is all verbal because with my dyslexia, I don't like to write. But some people, I say some people it's just better. It's optimal to have letters. Before you even go into a question, you already have the questions written out. Okay? So I'm going to show you two different ways this information is useful. One is identifying which muscles we're using for a specific exercise. Gravity is trying to adduct me. I need muscles that are trying to abduct me. I call those the abductors. Then I can use my circles to help me remember all of those muscles that are going to be helpful. So who are the abduction pullers? Well, we have our gluteus medius and minimus. Those are important abduction pullers. We have our piriformis muscle, important abduction puller. We have our tensor fascia latae, important abduction puller. Or you could say we really need to work on gluteus medius strength. We need to do exercises for this particular patient that works the gluteus medius for this. So I need to know how that muscle pulls. So then I could see what I need an external force to do. So therefore I get that muscle to turn. So the gluteus medius is an abductor. So I need an external force that's trying to adduct me. And then there may be some times where you need to do isometrics. There's sometimes you may need to do eccentrics. There's sometimes you may need to do concentrics. So we need to be able to work in all these different questions. Does that make sense? On the test, I just want to make sure you understand that if she lowers her leg down, I'm not using the adductor magnus. I'm still using the abductors, working eccentrically to adduct. If she used the adductor group, she'd literally slam her leg into the ground. What hip muscles at the left hip? Oh, he's not doing that one real well, huh, Grace? Remember when we did the illusions with 310? Talking about that pelvis? Is he applying is he internally or externally rotating his left hip? Something we're going to have to know. Yeah, absolutely. He's internally rotating the hip, so he'd be stretching external rotators. On the test, I might say, which of the following would be being stretched at her right hip? And I may give you rectus femoris, biceps femoris, long head. I'm just going to give you random muscles with one of them being in the group that's being lengthened. So to me, before you go to specific muscles, just identify, well, her hips extended, she's stretching hip flexors. And then which of the muscles Campbell listed is a hip flexion pull? Some other kind of questions. What is the function of the quadratus femoris? Give that some thought. Look at your circles, look at your lists. But I'm going to explain why this question, although very simple in structure, can be confusing. What is it? Anybody? It's a hip external rotator. Is it a hip external rotator on your right hip and your left hip? Or just on the right hip? Absolutely, on both. Yeah. The reason this question would be confusing is because your brains already know the word quad. You think of quads. And you also have a muscle called the rectus femoris, biceps femoris. So you have other muscles that have some of these words in it. Quadratus femoris just literally means a square quad-shaped muscle that's pulling on your feet. But that's an example of little details. That it can be easy to confuse quadratus femoris with rectus femoris, with biceps femoris. Make sense? All right, how about this? See that? All right. We analyze motion joint by joint. We analyze muscles joint by joint. So let's have a conversation. How about the muscles that would be working at her left hip? Maintain that position, hold that position. Hip extensors, absolutely. Your circles help you to see who are those muscles, or your lists, or and just be able to see pictures. Doesn't matter to me. But you need to be able to tell me gluteus maximus, semimembranosus, semitendinosus, and then there's the tricky biceps femoris. Long here. Guys, you know what we're going to learn is like, why does doing like a seated hip thrust, like with a barbell, like as an example, why are there certain muscles that emphasize your booty? We're going to talk about link tension relationship changes and how changing the position of muscles at the knee, put them on slack, and so they can't contribute as much. So other muscles that aren't crossing the knee aren't affected, and therefore they have to take up that slack. We're going to learn some cool stuff about how we can emphasize certain muscles in groups based off of joint positions that we can put other muscles. All right, what about the right hip? Grounding gravity is trying to do what? Grounding gravity is trying to do what to the right hip? Flex. Probably don't need hip flexors. Probably need hip extensors. Same muscles. Gluteus maximus, semimembranosus, semitendinosus, biceps femoris, long hip. I'm not saying that those muscles are working the same. I'm just saying they're both working to accomplish a job. The left one is to maintain that leg in that position with a rigid link. The right one is going to be influencing motion. let's say she comes up, let's say she's not squatting. Let's say she rotates about her hip to come back up. Does that make sense? What kind of contraction would that be? Of her right hip. Do we agree if she just turned off all of her muscles, she'd probably fall over forward? And there's more mass in the front. So she probably has to make herself come back up. So what type of contraction would that be? Concentric. And she lowers herself down. Eccentric. And if you want to put it into a sentence, her right hip extensors are going to make her extend concentrically when she comes up. And her right hip extensors are going to let her flex eccentrically when she goes down. Tess, if I ask you this kind of question, I'm not going to worry. It's pretty much the same muscles. Horizontal variation. Let's go left to right, right to left. Do y'all know that paddings push? Pads push. That would be some magical green padding that would be trying to pull our knees together. Take your time, but we should be able to say specific muscles, specific motions with specific contractions. We should be able to answer.
Starting from Spanish.
For this one, I just want to open in, meaning you tell me where you want to start. We're going to get the same answer, but we're going to go, we're going to do a full range of motion. So in other words, if you started from left to right, you're going to get the same answer by the time the other person gets from left to right. You start from right to left, you're going to have the same answer as when we get to the right to left. So I want to give you an open-ended, give you a full repetition, and we'll talk about it. So the start and finish is wherever you want to start. External force is trying, again, for the sake of this conversation, we're just going to say add. The machine is trying to above me. Cool. I don't need muscles that are trying to do the same thing. I need muscles that are trying to abduct me. Cool. Today we talk about who those specific muscles are. Pulls in the direction of adduction. 3 of them are super easy because they have that pull in their name. I love that. The brevis, longus, magnus. And then you have the cousin that went off to college at the knee, gracilis. This the cousin that's also a hip flexor, pectineus. It's not important to tell a client all of these muscles. It is important to know
who they are, because you never know who's going to have a problem, who's going to have a strain, who's going to have a pull, who's going to have surgery, who's going to have a contracture, who's going to have insufficient neural supply, can't keep up. So that way, when you read an MRI report and it says KNES is atrophied, oh gosh, well, that doesn't sound like the hamstring, so I guess I can't help this person. So you see a muscle called the pectineus, and you're like, okay, let me go back to my undergraduate. What does it do? How does it pull? Okay, I need to work on that pectineus. It's a hip flexor, and it's a hip adductor. So if it's flexion puller, I need to do exercises that are trying to extend. If it's an adduction puller, I need to do exercises that are trying to adduct. And if I can really get fancy, I want to do a combination, trying to extend and adduct, so that muscle is working in two planes. You need to emphasize isometrics in this phase of rehab. No problem. I know how that muscle pulls, so I know how to create resistance against. Now we need to segue into more concentric contraction. Minimize eccentric, emphasize concentric. You need to know how to set those things up. Now emphasize eccentric. See why this is important. I know you do, but I'll have to tell them why this is important. I always feel, having been somebody who went through 10 years of college, I took a lot of classes that had, and I'm being very generous, that had nothing to do with what. I'm not saying, yeah, I am saying, screw it. No, I'm biased because I'm here. This is not dumb. This is useful. We can use this stuff. We will use this stuff. And it gets your money's worth. Okay. But it is tough. But the more we do it, the better we get at it, just like anything else. The more we practice, the better we get at it. If I were you, that would be weird. But if I were you, I wouldn't just wait for class to practice. We're kinesiology. You work out, you exercise, you work with people, you watch sports. It's all practice. Go to Google, type in hip exercises, practice. Go to Google, type in hip stretches, practice. That's why she's here. That's why I'm here. Good? All right, I'll get off my pulpit, stop preaching to you. Have a good one.